Good morning, everyone. My name is Matthew Curran. I'm Director of Food Safety for the department. A little bit about food safety. So Mr. Paul Pagano is in the back. He is our Assistant Director. Mr. Matt Colson, he is our Chief of Food Inspection. Ms. Diane Pickett up here, she is our Chief of Laboratories. And Mr. Zach Collin, who couldn't be with us today, he is our Chief of Bureau of Dairy Industries. So we have 3 bureaus in the division, and we cover, in our realm, about 50,000 facilities, 45 to 50,000 different facilities in the dairy and food world. So in our Bureau of Food Inspection, which covers most of the facilities, we deal primarily in this bureau with grocery stores, convenience stores, to the tune of about 40,000 of those out there. Obviously, Florida is a very large state, 3rd largest in the nation, so we have a lot of food consumed in our state. Restaurants are obviously another big food establishment, but those are food service establishments, and they are covered by DBPR, or Department of Business and Professional Regulation. So they have probably equally as many restaurants out there. So the food world is very large. In the Bureau of Food Inspection, we also cover all manufacturing of food. So any food that is processed in any way, prepared, not served, but prepared, packaged, that sort of thing, that is all covered by us as well. So there are about 5,000 different processors and warehouses and stuff like that, those type of establishments in Florida. And then we have federal regulations that we adopt to ensure that those facilities are operating under sanitary conditions. 21 CFR Part 117 is preventive controls under the Food Safety and Modernization Act, and that's a fairly new federal requirement that all processors must adhere to. And on the retail side, we adopt the food code, which those 2 standards are universal throughout the country. So that means that if you're operating in Florida or Georgia or Alaska or Washington or Kansas or what have you, you're going to have to comply with the same standards. And so that is a very big advantage to not only regulators but to businesses as well. So a lot of corporations, entities are multi-state, so they're operating in other areas. And that means that they're not having to learn different requirements when they operate in other states. Bureau of Dairy Industry. Dairy is typically separated into a different statute, so that operates out of Chapter 502 in Florida statutes. And that's something that's historic throughout the country. Obviously, dairy is food. We consume that as part of our diet if you like dairy. But most states do have that as a separate program, often governed under different regulations. And so I mentioned the food code before. Dairy regulations are the pasteurized milk ordinance, and that's kind of their code, if you will. And it's also a federal code governed by the Food and Drug Administration, FDA. So again, states will adopt this, and so that way dairy farmers that are doing business in multiple states or dairy processors that are doing business in multiple states have to adhere to the same codes in each of those states. They don't have to learn different codes in different states. But again, dairy historically is separated into a different program, has different requirements, but they're all intended to ensure that the products are produced and sold under sanitary conditions. So you have grade A and non-grade A milk and milk products. Frozen desserts can range from your ice creams all the way to popsicles and things that are non-dairy, but those are also typically inspected and governed under the dairy programs throughout the country. Our Bureau of Laboratories, which is located here in Tallahassee, we have a large number of chemists and biologists and technicians that analyze samples from both the dairy and food inspection programs, and they test those samples for contaminants. Make sure that there's nothing in it that is going to pose itself to be hazardous to consumers. And so they typically will sample different types of samples. Obviously, you can think of probably a million different types of food and food combinations that are out there. We all have our own tastes and our own palate. So they roam around, the inspectors will go out and will sample their products, and they will survey different types of commodities and send them into the laboratory for testing. If we find anything that doesn't meet the standards, that is contaminated either biologically, with pathogens, E. coli, salmonella, or chemically with heavy metals or pesticides, or any sort of other contaminants that aren't suitable for consumption, those products will be taken off the market and will not allowed to be sold. Also, we look for labeling and misbranding, so that way you as a consumer, when you buy a product, you know what is actually inside of that product, and you're not having to guess as to what's in it. Our intent with the hemp program is to treat the hemp extract as defined in statute in Chapter 581 as another food ingredient, whether it's flour, whether it's corn syrup, whether it's salt, pepper, what have you. It's another ingredient that's going to be used in food. Now, there are additional requirements in Chapter 581 that apply mostly to labeling. So there has to be additional QR code, lab report, laboratory testing. Obviously the sensitivity with this is THC. And there's a threshold on the amount of THC that can be contained in the sample. And you guys as farmers are all familiar with the hemp and the marijuana plants and the differences and the trials and tribulations that come along keeping hemp separated from marijuana. And Brian will talk a little more about that sort of stuff in his presentation. But so those additional labeling requirements are designed so that way the customer can be assured that they're not buying sample with THC in it. That has to be sold under Florida's medical marijuana program, which is administered by the Department of Health. And so with that, our rules and our intent here is to make it just another food ingredient. So individuals selling hemp extract, which may or may not be any of you in this room because we're more looking at the end product at processing and after processing that's sold to the consumers, but our intent is to treat those as food establishments. And if you're familiar with our proposed rules, they're called hemp food establishments, which they're going to be subject to the same requirements that I mentioned earlier that any other food establishment is subject to now. We don't want to lessen those standards or make them any more strict. We want to make sure that those products are being sold to consumers in a sanitary manner. So our inspectors will go out and will sample these products just as they would any other food products, and that'll include the oils and any sort of brownies, baked goods, cookies, or whatever form that the market drives to put the hemp extract in. We'll sample those products and test it to make sure that it meets the requirements of the law and our rules that we're looking to adopt. And so if you are going to get into the processing or into the retail sale of these commodities, you will have to apply with us for a food permit, go through the application process, and then subject to our inspections out in the field, and then product sampling and testing as I described before. So on our website, you can find all this information of how to apply, what steps are required to apply, and also there's contact information so you can call any one of us at any time and we'll answer your questions, get everything straight for you. Is anyone here that's here a current food permit holder? Anyone? No. So if you guys do get into this end of things, it'll be new for you. So we encourage you to call first before you invest any money, before you make application, just so that way you can talk to someone. They'll talk you through the process. We do have a plan review program, which is optional. And what that program does is if you're going to get into that business, you can submit the information to us, and one of our experts will look through it, will talk with you, kind of point out some things that you might run into as you go through that process. We really don't want you to go down that road, invest money, build something, invest in something, and then we tell you that's not going to work because that's going to be money out of your pocket. That's going to be wasted. So it's a fairly inexpensive process, typically less than $100, and it'll save you potentially thousands in the long run because they'll be able to head that off at the pass and tell you that's not going to work, this design's not going to work, this will work, and what have you. So we really encourage you to take advantage of that process if you do elect to get into the hemp food establishment world. So I'm going to wrap it up there, and Mr. Matt Colson, he will be sitting on the panel throughout today, and we'll be happy to answer any questions you have now or later. Thank you.